Hello, friends. I hope you're doing well today. One of the most interesting aspects of Nietzsche was his ability to predict the men who would later interpret his work. Carl Jung credited much of his psychological theories and insights from Nietzsche, and was known in his day for hosting a series of in depth seminars and lectures on Nietzsche's writings and on Nietzsche's growth and who he became. Spengler credited Nietzsche's observations as the spark for the famous science of civilizational cycles that he's known for. And Evola credited Nietzsche for being the first to correctly diagnose the problems of modernity. And this was the basis for all of Evola's writings, of course. Each of them criticized Nietzsche in their own way, and each of them thought of themselves as a superior extension of his work, despite the fact that they all based their own work on his. Nietzsche would, if he were alive and in his writing, disagrees with them. Each of them he has a criticism for. And what's amazing about Nietzsche is that he predicted the rise of a legion of false followers who would misinterpret his work. And these misinterpretations would happen before the arrival of an overman in the future who would correctly understand him. The entire third section, the last section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, is dedicated to going through this legion of false followers and succinctly disavowing them and showing how they are false in their interpretations. And funnily enough, Jung, Spengler, and Evola are represented by Nietzsche as the magician, the soothsayer, and the last pope. These are people that come to Nietzsche as a prophet, but fundamentally, they are not the overman. They are not the superman. If I can start with Jung, Jung greatly admired Nietzsche, as mentioned. He called Nietzsche the most introspective man who ever lived. But he focused on how Nietzsche apparently went mad, and he sort of was saying that he was better than Nietzsche because he didn't go mad, and he was just as introspective, but he didn't go mad. So he based a lot of what became modern psychology on Nietzsche's work. And using Nietzsche's work to create psychology is a crime. That is a complete trick. It's using something which has spiritual significance and it's turning it into uh, this weird sort of psychotherapy stuff. So Nietzsche would call Jung the magician. And the magician, in that chapter of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, when confronted by Zarathustra, says, "The penitent in spirit, the poet and magician, who at last turneth his spirit against himself, the transformed one, who is freezeth to death by his bad science and conscience." Zarathustra goes on to say, "I divine thee will. Thou hast become the enchanter of all the world. For thyself, thou hast no lie or artifice left. Thou art disenchanted to thyself." So these words by Zarathustra and the words by the magician are in response to the magician going through a long series of revelations at the beginning of the chapter, where he's telling the public, he's telling them, "Oh, God wants to torture us. We have a hanged God. That's the problem." And these are all the sorts of stuff that Jung says. Jung talks about the unconscious and the collective unconscious and the death of God and how God is tormenting you with pity and how you must overcome and become greater. And these are sort of his revelations, but they're really derivative revelations off of the truth that Nietzsche is speaking. And what's more is that all of Jung's terms, like the shadow, the collective unconscious, they're little tricks. They have no higher metaphysical understanding. And ultimately, when you apply them, you, as Zarathustra, or as the old man said when confronted by Zarathustra, it transforms you and it freezes you to death by bad science and conscience. So essentially, modern psychology, what Jung created, is a way to freeze yourself to death with bad science, which I think is really insightful because you're denying any sort of transcendent truth. Well, you're not even denying it, but you're sort of just freezing it to death with all these psychological terms instead of focusing on the higher. So Nietzsche, Zarathustra would call Jung the magician because he's using the actual divine works of Zarathustra to cast these little spells, but it's detached from the one truth. And he specifically says in this chapter that all your little truths deny the one truth. They deny the will to power. They deny Ahura Mazda. Okay, they deny the sun god. They deny the prophet. They deny the will to power. They deny the fight between life and death, which Zarathustra talks about. So Nietzsche predicted that someone like Jung would come along, called the magician, and would use Nietzsche's works to create little spells, which you can think of as modern psychology. Next up, there's Spengler. So Spengler used Nietzsche's works about the fall of this civilization because it's exhausted to create a theory of civilization where civilizations rise and fall. And these civilizations, in their rise and in their fall, it's very deterministic. So we are in the winter of the Faustian civilization. And no matter what we do as individuals, this civilizational organism will die and it will give birth to a new civilization. We're in the age of Caesars, and there's nothing us as individuals can do to change it. So Nietzsche, Zarathustra, calls this person the soothsayer. And the soothsayer, in that chapter of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, says, "And I saw a great sadness come over mankind. The best turned weary of their works. A doctrine appeared. A faith ran behind it. All is empty. All is alike. All hath been. And from all the hills there re-echoed, all is empty. All is alike. All hath been. To be sure, we have harvested. But why have all our fruits become rotten and brown? Why was it fell last night from the evil moon? In vain was all our labor." I believe that this succinctly matches Spengler's conclusion. Because why would we work hard for anything if civilization's just going to die or if it's just going to be born? What is the point of anything if everything just repeats in this boring way? And Zarathustra in this chapter, after hearing this, and honestly, I had a sort of similar reaction when first encountering Spengler. It's almost like this bad dream. And this is what happens to Zarathustra, where you think, well, if everything just repeats endlessly, then what's the point of everything? It's like you're drowning yourself. What's the point? And after this bad dream, essentially what happens is Zarathustra has this long bad dream, and then Zarathustra suddenly has a good dream. And after being depressed, he then thinks of all the good things in life and all the new things left to see. And he explicitly says at one point, he says, there's new stars left to see. There's new adventures to have in the night. And he says, if you want to be depressed, soothsayer, if you think that everything is fixed, then so be it. But we're going to go see new things. And I think that's so powerful. That's so true. Spengler almost misinterprets Nietzsche's work to soothe himself, to think, well, there's nothing that could be done. But Nietzsche says, no, there's a greater destiny for mankind. There's new things to see. There's a manifest destiny. There's the will to power. There's the great men that we are creating. to create ultimately the great man, to reach God. And we are on this journey. And sure, things will repeat, things are cyclical, there is eternal recurrence, but it leads somewhere. It leads to the new and exciting and the higher. And you shouldn't be depressed, Spengler. And then Zarathustra, at the end of the chapter, sits down next to the soothsayer, which is really what became Spengler, and basically just tries to cheer him up and says, "Hey, I can go find you an ocean that you can drown yourself in if you want to be depressed, but we're gonna feast because we have great things to look forward to." And lastly, I save the best for last. We have Evola. So Evola, Nietzsche, Zarathustra calls the last pope, and essentially there is this last pope, and he is searching through all the mountains. He's looking for Zarathustra because he's looking for somebody who still believes in God. And he says to Zarathustra explicitly, "I serve that old God until his last hour. Perhaps the old God no longer liveth. But essentially, what are we going to do?" He says, "Help me, Zarathustra. I'm looking for this God. I believe in this God. I'm loyal to this God. And I don't care that everyone else says it's dead, but I'm looking to join this." And if you look at the traditionalist line of thinking, this is exactly what Evola believes. He believes that all the traditional, what he calls like sacred orders, have sort of died out, they've been corrupted, and there's none left to join. And Evola is leading his life looking for one, but he can't find one. And so he sort of just tries to hold on. He just tries to believe in this old god anyways. He calls it riding the tiger. He says you just have to as best as possible carry that light with you. But Zarathustra disagrees with this. Zarathustra says, "Let him go." He does a prolonged meditation. He says, "Let him go, he is gone. And though it honoreth thee that thou speaketh only in praise of this dead one," essentially you have to let it go. And then he, Zarathustra, gives a very insightful speech. He says, "When he was young, that god out of the Orient, then was he harsh and revengeful, and built himself a hell for the delight of his favorites. At last, however, he became old and soft and mellow, pitiful, more like a grandfather than a father, but most like a tottering old grandmother. There did he shriveled in his chimney corner, fretting on account of his weak legs, world weary, will weary, and one day he suffocated of his all too great pity." So obviously, what Nietzsche is saying here is that the God has aged, the God grew old. In his youth, if you think about the Old Testament, God was, strong. He was giving out orders. He was asserting his will to power. He was asserting his vitality with the laws he laid down. But as he grew older, he became more and more weak and pitiful until he shriveled up like an old grandmother and eventually just suffocated on pity. And I think there's no better way to describe what happened to Christianity. And what Zarathustra says to the last pope, which later, you know, this is the mantle that Evola takes on, is that essentially you need to let the old man die. Like the old man's dead, let him rest. You're trying to like dust off his grave, and he's just trying to get some shut eye. He's lived a long, weary life, and he needs rest. And you should stop. You just let him go. Basically, you're honoring him more if you let him go and you remember the good things about him, and you don't just try and have his like puppet body that you're like sort of dragging around and pretending. And essentially, Zarathustra's wider message is that there is a new God here. There's a new God being born. And you should give up on this old one so that the new one can arrive. And I think that's a very powerful message. I think that's the message of like Dionysus as Nietzsche, as Zarathustra. And that's the message that he's giving. He's like this old god, kind of Apollonian in nature, based off of Plato. This god is now dead, and it's time for the new Dionysian god to rule and to just like let the old man die. You've given it a good run, but it's done now. So those are the three characters. There's a lot more in Thus Spoke Zarathustra because Nietzsche and Zarathustra go through every single type of person who he prophesizes will misread his work, and you can find examples of every type of person. And there's a lot like Heidegger is in there. Like those old German aristocrats is like the two last kings, and there's a lot more. And he basically predicts like every type of person who will misinterpret his work. And what I find sort of amazing is that people like Carl Jung and Evola and Spengler could read Nietzsche's work enough that they base their work off of his work, and then yet not have the awareness, or maybe on some level they did have the awareness that they are themselves the caricatures that he's describing, and that he's saying, no, you're not understanding, you're not a true follower, you are not the higher man, you are. And particularly in Carl Jung's case, the magician and Zarathustra have a discussion of like, hey, you know that you're not really the higher man, right? You can say all these things, you can sort of have all these revelations from my work, but you know that you're not the higher man, right? And then Carl Jung, or like the magician, actually admits to it. And it's very interesting because Carl Jung would definitely say the same thing, like, uh, if you really confronted him, if you saw past all of these, like the collective unconscious and stuff like that, like if you actually looked into the deeper metaphysics of like the future of civilization and like what actually is all this stuff, then it is kind of a sham. And so I think that's one of the things that makes Nietzsche and Zarathustra and Dionysus so great. It's that he predicted how all these people would misinterpret his work. And now we live at this time in history. There's an example of every single caricature that Nietzsche wrote uh, in his book, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. And now there is time, and Nietzsche wrote that this would take about, within 2 centuries, he said, that his ideas have echoed around the world for enough time that finally everyone's ears have picked up on it, and the higher man, the superman, will hear the call, will hear the actual proper interpretation of his work, and then will use it to create the Dionysian state. And in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche talks a lot about this, creating the Dionysian state. And Zarathustra ends off Thus Spoke Zarathustra by basically calling out to the higher man, like, I'm waiting for you, I know you're coming, it's going to take a while. And that all these other people who interpreted my work, they're almost like leeching off of the magical energy, because Nietzsche, it's so interesting, pervades our culture. He's the basis for psychology. Everyone loves posting Nietzsche stuff. They love vitalist art. They love all these Dionysian things. But Nietzsche himself, his actual message to create the Dionysian state, it's actually not been followed. At every step, people have sucked the energy but then twisted it. And it's this sort of process of incorrectly interpreting the work, as he lays out in the third section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that actually basically like rings out all the possible ways you can go wrong to create the opportunity for the higher man to come and take Nietzsche's work and put it to its true purpose. So, with that said, let me know what you think about all of that. I think that Nietzsche is a very profound person in history, and I even think to this day it's not fully recognized yet his true extent, the true impact that he will have on history.